Good evening. I want to welcome you to our Wednesday night devotional. You know, a lot of things have been going on in the last few months. I guess you could say 2020 has not been a very good year. And I know everyone's feeling that. In fact, sometimes it's somewhat frustrating to even talk about. But other things have been happening here recently with all the unrest across America. There's just been a lot of things and sights and sounds and things that we have seen, even in our own community, but of course across the nation. And you see such a huge divide in the country. You also see that, you know, a lot of things that we have to really reflect upon and consider and make things better. At the same time, we realize that there are actors out there that are not doing anything to make things better. They're only making things worse. Some are motivated politically. Some are in positions of power. Some are on the media. Some are in our own communities. And so as a Christian, quite often we ask ourselves, how do I address this? Well, we have the answer, and the answer is in the Bible. So I really felt like this would be somewhat relative this evening to talk about just for a minute. And then I want us to get into our devotional thoughts and devotional lesson this evening. So I'm reminded by what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2. When I say I'm reminded because hopefully I've read this more than once in my life, and I hope that we all study this from time to time. So how do Christians react when there's so much turmoil and there's a lot of frustration? And we all have emotions. We're human. We get upset, and we're looking to solve a problem, and we hear both sides, and then we have, you know, you begin to sometimes even consider things and maybe in a angry mode. So let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter says this, therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babes, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. Now, if you go down of chapter 2 down to verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare that praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and as strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits you. Now, if you go down to verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king and as the supreme authority, or to the governors who sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of the foolish men. I can't help but think that we need to really reflect upon that. And I wish as a society we could. But we understand that society doesn't work that way in the secular world. But Christians are supposed to. We are to consider ourselves as a people that are to shine a light. And that light is to reflect Christ. And reflect Christ in everything that we do. But so in the coming days and months, as we consider our words, as we consider our actions, let people see Christians all over, of all colors, of all ethnic origins, of all nations, reflect what God would have us to do. Now, for tonight's Bible study, turn over to Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Tonight is kind of a Bible study in the sense that we're going to get into a narrative, and I'm going to do my best to give you the abridged version, if you will. This is a sermon that recently I preached at Black Oak, and the name of the sermon was Hypocrisy and Humility. We don't have enough time to go through all of that this evening, but I do believe that there are some things here that we can pick up very quickly. So Luke chapter 14, and all I'm going to do is conduct this as a Bible study in the sense that as we read through the verses, I'm going to add a few things to what we're seeing and some things that many have observed in studying this particular passage. And when we've concluded this passage, then we can take the message of God with us. Luke 14. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. And he took him and he healed him and he let him go. Then he answered them, saying, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into the pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him to these things. Now let's stop there for a moment. If you read through Matthew chapter 23, Matthew chapter 12, you go to Luke chapter 20 and verse 20, and you read throughout the Gospels, you know one thing. The Pharisees, the ruling class, was out to get Jesus. He was a threat to their authority. And in their minds, he was no Messiah. He was not what they considered would be what the Messiah would look like. And then we go into Luke chapter 20, we see this same verbiage again. They watched him closely. Why did they watch him closely? Were they watching him out of curiosity? Were they watching him in admiration? No, they were not. They were looking to trap Christ. They were looking to find some charge, something that they could take to the authorities, they could take before court. And eventually we see that happening in just a few months from this time. We see that happening, of course, on the night of Jesus' betrayal. We see the kangaroo court. We see the lynch mob mentality. We see Jesus being tried and without getting any kind of due process, under the cover of darkness, under the cover of night, and within 18 hours, he's on the cross. And they carried out very much what exactly that they wanted. Jesus, of course, talked about these people when he talked about the Pharisees and the chief priests. He talked in the sense that, listen, you do what they say. You do what they're teaching, because in the scriptures and in what they were teaching, of course, and they were the authorities on the law of Moses. Of course, they added a lot to it, and they put heavy burdens on the people, and their interpretations was only in many respects to help them keep their power and keep their authority. But Jesus said, what they say you do, but you don't do what they do. You don't do that. You don't act like them. And so as we read throughout the book of Luke, even if you go into chapter 13, Jesus had healed on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and they were upset. They were ready to run him out of town. How dare he heal on the Sabbath? This wasn't the only time. Quite often, the Pharisees were always doing things to try to bring Jesus in, and in a sense, try to trick him. You know, they had all kinds of questions all the time. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? By whose authority do you do this? What about your disciples and them eating on the Sabbath? I mean, there were so many different things that they were trying to catch Christ. You remember the adulterous woman that they threw in front of Jesus? and they were ready and say, here's what the law says. This is what we're supposed to do. What is your interpretation of that? And in each case, they watched him closely. Now, I don't see Jesus getting a position of honor at this particular dinner. In fact, if you look at verse 1, it says, he went to eat bread on the Sabbath. And Jesus, no doubt, knew exactly what was going on here. But even though Jesus knew exactly what they were up to, I mean, when you find it convenient that a man needed to be healed who had dropsy, he just happened to be in their presence. And if you'll notice, he wasn't really one of the regular guests, because as soon as Jesus heals that man, what does he do? He leaves. He leaves. That doesn't sound like someone that everybody knew. It doesn't sound like someone that everyone wanted to say, hey, man, we knew this was the right place to bring you. We knew if we brought you here today that good things might happen. No, that's not. In fact, they don't celebrate his healing whatsoever. The Bible says they remain silent. Silent. But going back to my thought, Jesus, still knowing all this, knowing what they were up to, he still went to them. You see, that's the way Christ works. And that's the way as Christians that we must work. Regardless of the evils of the world, regardless of who might be persecuting us, regardless of the actions of bad characters, we must be willing to meet them. We must be willing to spread the gospel. We must be willing to reflect Christ in all ways. So what happens here? Well, Jesus, knowing what they're thinking, says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He's been down this road before. You have to look back at some of the narratives before to understand that. But what did they do? They kept silent. You see, the hypocrisy is so evident here, because they bring him in as if to show him the courtesy of hospitality. But in that hospitality, what do? They're out to get him. Someone might say, well, you know, it's easy to see that, but that's not a problem of us today. Are you kidding me? How often have we, from time to time, put on an act, if you will, maybe gave a smile to someone that we really didn't want to smile to, but we sure didn't want to say what we had in our heart? Or how often have we maybe said something or went to hear the news or the gossip or something like that about someone just so we could know something that was maybe negative about that person, whether it was true or not? And sometimes did that affect the way we treated that person based upon maybe gossip or things that was not right? You see, we all, from time to time, can be guilty of hypocrisy. We can have a front, but not really mean it. We may be sitting in a business meeting or an employee meeting, acting as if we're doing so much work, while we know down deep that we've really not been doing a whole lot. We've really not been working very hard. You see, hypocrisy is not just something 2,000 years ago among the Pharisees. Hypocrisy can be something even now, and it divides our churches quite often. In our congregations, from time to time, it besets one brother against another brother and another sister against another sister, all under the disguise as if everything's okay. That's why the Bible teaches us that if there are things that we need to resolve them up front. We need to have that dialogue, and we need to do it in a prayerful way. You see, they were not intended on that. They were intended on trying to catch Christ. But then Jesus, of course, demonstrates to them that he's going to carry on the good news in their work. And he carries it on right here, and he heals this man. And then Jesus tells them a parable, and I want to conclude with that parable. So he told them this parable when he noted how they chose the best places. He says, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man, then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, Go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up to a higher place. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus immediately turns around and brings in the application. And the application is humility. The application is, don't think so highly of yourself. Be careful how you judge. Don't expect in this world what is yours. We hear a lot of that today. What's mine, my right, my this, my voice, I'm going to be heard. People beat their chest from time to time. We hear things like that all the time. And sometimes we can be very guilty of that ourselves. Maybe it's in more of a passive-aggressive way, but we can be very guilty of things like that. And yet Jesus says you conduct yourself with humility. Don't put yourself in the position of honor. If it is the graciousness of the host, he will move you to that place of honor. And brethren, when we think about God, it is God's grace, and it is God's grace as the host of the feast that each one of us have been forgiven, that each one of us have been brought up into the body. It's not something we deserved. It's not something we've earned. And it's not something that we should have the expectations of looking at God the Father and saying, I want my comeuppance. I want what I deserve. I want to be known. It's not any of those things. In fact, in God's kingdom, we are to clothe ourselves with humility. We are to act in a way where people can see that we're different than the norm. Well, there's a lot more in all this, and this kind of divided up quickly, but for time purposes, I hope this evening that you'll study this even more. Luke chapter 14. Thank you for being with us this evening, and God bless you.